In a world where degrees define destiny, one man chose to unlearn everything he knew. He stepped out of privilege and into the desert. While others built skyscrapers in cities, he built hope in forgotten villages. This is the story of a rebel with a purpose, a school with no walls, and grandmothers who lit up the night. This is the story of Bunker Roy and the Barefoot College. The year was 1945. The world was changing, nations were rebuilding, and India was still under British rule, its people dreaming of freedom. In a small town called Burnpur, nestled among hills and factories, a child was born into comfort. His name was Sanjit Roy. His family didn't worry about food, water, or shelter. His home had polished floors, servants in uniform, and the quiet hum of fans that never stopped spinning. While thousands of Indian children studied under trees or not at all, Sanjit had textbooks from England, polished shoes, and iron shirts. He was part of the English-speaking elite, a rare class that lived between two worlds, the old India and the new India, shaped by privilege. Everyone had high hopes for the boy. He was bright, well-mannered, and curious. By the time he was ready for school, his parents sent him to one of the best, the Doon School in Dehradun. It was more than a school. It was a training ground for future prime ministers, CEOs, and diplomats. The boys there were taught to lead, to speak with power, to carry themselves like the rulers of tomorrow. Sanjit was no exception. He learned how to quote Shakespeare, debate politics, and carry a blazer with pride. His classmates were the sons of India's most powerful families, boys whose futures were mapped out with ambition and success. Sanjit, too, was on that path. He had everything: education, status, language, and a ticket to a bright, influential life. But life has a strange way of planting seeds that grow quietly, hidden from the world, until one day, they break through the soil and reach for the sun. No one could have predicted that this soft-spoken boy from the hills, raised in silk and silver, would one day walk barefoot into dusty villages, sit beside the poor, and decide to spend his life not in palaces, but in huts. Not to take, but to give. This is the story of that boy, of the fire that grew in his heart, of how he became a builder of barefoot dreams. The Doon School campus buzzed with ambition. The boys spoke of Harvard, Oxford, and the Indian Administrative Service. They wore dreams like tailored suits, sharp, polished, destined for power. But somewhere in the middle of this parade of certainty, Bunker began to feel something different. It was quiet at first, just a whisper, a faint question that didn't come from a teacher or a textbook, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that couldn't be ignored. While his classmates charted their futures on clean white paper, Bunker stared out the window, watching the trees bend in the mountain wind. And in that wind, he heard the question that would change his life forever. What about the people no one sees? It echoed in his chest like a drumbeat. Who spoke for the villagers whose names never appeared in newspapers? Who dreamed for the barefoot children who never saw the inside of a school? He remembered the workers in the fields, the women carrying water for miles, the men breaking rocks under a brutal sun. People whose hands were calloused, whose backs were bent, and whose lives seemed invisible to the world he was being groomed to join. Something was shifting inside him, something powerful, something undeniable. While others chased prestige, Bunker felt pulled in the opposite direction, away from glass offices and smooth boardroom tables, and toward the dusty roads where no one was watching. He didn't know it yet, but the seed had been planted. And it would grow, stubborn and wild, until it cracked open the life he was supposed to live, and led him into the one he was born for. Sometimes, all it takes is a single question to change the course of a life. And for Bunker Roy, that question was already calling him into the unknown. It was 1965. The air was thick with pain and hunger. Bihar, one of India's poorest states, was in crisis. A brutal famine had swept through the land, stripping it bare. Crops had failed. Rivers had dried. Thousands were dying in silence, not from war, but from the slow, invisible cruelty of hunger. While the country debated policy in air-conditioned halls, Bunker Roy made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He turned his back on comfort and walked straight into the heart of the suffering. Not as a savior, not with fanfare or fame, but with humility. He joined a famine relief camp deep in rural Bihar. Dust clung to his clothes. Flies buzzed around hollow faces. Children with swollen bellies stared at him with blank eyes. It was no longer something he read about in papers. It was real. It was right in front of him. Most people in his position would have arrived with solutions, with plans, strategies, and speeches. But Bunker did something radically different. He listened. He sat beside farmers and laborers. He asked them about their lives, their struggles, their wisdom. He didn't come to teach, he came to learn. He dug wells with blistered hands. The same hands that once held polished pens and school trophies now held a spade, covered in sweat and mud. He worked under the burning sun, shoulder to shoulder with the villagers. He ate what they ate, simple rice and salt. He slept where they slept, on the floor, under the stars, without a fan, without a bed. And slowly, something extraordinary happened. The villagers, who had been ignored for so long, began to speak. They shared their stories, their knowledge, their ideas. Bunker began to see something the world had missed, that these people were not helpless. They were not broken. They were brilliant in their own way. They knew how to harness wind, how to harvest water, how to survive on little and build with nothing. They didn't need charity. They needed dignity. They needed belief. And Bunker Roy, the boy from privilege, was finally learning the greatest lesson of his life. That true education doesn't only come from books. It lives in the hands of the poor, in the silence of struggle, in the wisdom of those who have endured. This was not a mission. It was a transformation. And it was only the beginning. In the world Bunker Roy came from, intelligence wore a suit and tie. It came with certificates, polished English, and prestigious names printed on resumes. For years, he believed it, because that's what his elite schooling had taught him, that knowledge lives in universities, and success is something you frame and hang on a wall. But in the dusty villages of India, that belief began to unravel. Bunker started to see something the world refused to see. There was a man who fixed broken radios with nothing but a blade, a copper wire, and instinct. No degree, no training, just pure, problem-solving genius. There was a woman who delivered babies with calm hands and ancient wisdom, a midwife who had never stepped into a hospital but had saved more lives than some trained doctors. There was a farmer who could read the sky like a book, who knew when the rains would come, how deep to dig a well, which plant would survive a drought. Not because he read a textbook, but because he listened to the earth his whole life. These people had no diplomas, no LinkedIn profiles, no framed achievements. They were barefoot. They were invisible to the cities, but they were brilliant. Bunker began to ask himself, who decided what knowledge really was? Why did society worship paper degrees, but ignore the man who could bring water to a desert with a handmade pump? He realized the system was broken. It was upside down. It celebrated theory and ignored wisdom. It uplifted those who could write essays and abandoned those who could build dreams with their hands. And that was the moment it hit him, like a lightning bolt. The resume is dead. Real skill, real intelligence, real leadership, it wasn't always found in classrooms. It was in the calloused hands of the poor, in the quiet minds of those the world overlooked. That realization shook him to his core, because it meant that everything he had once believed about success was wrong. And if the world was going to change, really change, then it had to start by redefining who we call educated. From that day forward, Bunker Roy made a vow to honor knowledge in all its forms, to build a place where being barefoot didn't mean being broken, but being brilliant in a different way. The revolution had begun not in boardrooms, but in the villages, and it would change everything. In 1972, Bunker Roy found himself standing in the heart of Rajasthan, in a dusty, sun-scorched town called Tylonia. The land around him was dry and cracked, the air thick with heat. But in that barren place, something extraordinary was about to be born. It was here, in the quiet of the desert, that Bunker founded the Barefoot College, a school unlike any other. It wasn't built on the foundation of chalkboards, exams, or walls adorned with diplomas. No, this was a place for a different kind of learning, the kind that lived in the sweat of labor, the wisdom of the elders, and the courage of those who had nothing to lose. The concept was simple, yet radical, a school for the poor, by the poor. A place where the village people, the ones often ignored by society, could come, not to be taught, but to teach. A school without blackboards, without textbooks, without grades. Instead, the lessons were taught by the land itself. The elders shared their wisdom through stories. The children learned by doing, by planting trees, digging wells, and making things with their hands. Here, they weren't treated as empty vessels to be filled with knowledge. They were recognized as full of knowledge, just waiting for the right opportunity to express it. Bunker knew this was a radical idea. No one in the world had ever tried it like this before. But he believed deeply in one truth, that true education doesn't happen in classrooms, it happens in life. The Barefoot College was a place where people learned how to build solar panels from scratch, where grandmothers learned to repair broken wind turbines, where young girls were taught to read the sky and the earth and use their hands to change the world around them. It was a place of empowerment, not just for the mind, but for the body and the spirit. There were no paper degrees to be awarded, no exams to pass. The only test was how well you could do, how much you could learn from the soil beneath your feet and the people around you. The lessons weren't given in the language of theory. They were taught in the language of experience. And so, the school grew, slowly but surely. It was no longer just a place for children, it was a movement, a revolution, a place where people of all ages came to break free from the chains of traditional education, where they came to find their own power, to realize their own potential. The Barefoot College was not a school in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something that could not be measured by exams, grades, or certificates. It was a school that taught the world to walk barefoot and to walk proudly, because true knowledge has no boundaries. It lives in the hands of those who work, in the hearts of those who serve, and in the souls of those who dream without limits. Bunker Roy's mission was simple, but profound, to empower the people who had been forgotten by society. The ones who lived in the shadows of progress, the ones whose names never appeared in headlines, the ones whose lives were measured in struggles, not opportunities. But Bunker believed in one thing above all else, that if you give people the tools to help themselves, they can change their world. And so, he began with light. In the villages where Bunker had worked, darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was the absence of hope. Villagers spent their nights in pitch-black rooms, unable to read, study, or work. The darkness seemed to mirror the isolation they felt from the world. And when night fell, they were cut off from everything, from knowledge, from communication, from connection. But Bunker had a vision, a simple one. He wanted to bring light to these villages. Not just a flicker from candles or kerosene lamps that burned the air and drained wallets. He wanted to bring clean, sustainable energy to the people. Solar energy, something that could give them independence, something they could control. The idea was daring: solar panels, in a place where even electricity was a rare commodity. But Bunker believed that the villagers didn't need outsiders to come in and solve their problems. They didn't need experts. They needed knowledge. They needed to learn how to use their own resources, how to harness the sun, and how to become the masters of their own energy. And so, the first project began, teaching villagers how to install solar panels. Bunker didn't just bring in ready-made systems, he brought the knowledge to build them. He showed them how to assemble the panels from scratch, how to install them, and how to maintain them. The people didn't just become users of energy, they became creators of it. They could generate their own electricity, power their own homes, and light their own future. The first village to benefit from this transformation was Tylonia itself. And when the lights flickered on for the first time, when the lamps glowed in the hearts of the village homes, something incredible happened. It wasn't just the physical light that lit up the faces of the villagers. It was the light of possibility. For the first time, they were no longer at the mercy of power grids and outsiders. They were no longer dependent on expensive, polluting fuel. They had taken control of their own energy. And that simple act of lighting up their homes, something most of the world takes for granted, sparked a deeper change within them. They had a new sense of agency. They had power, real power. And as word spread, more and more villages joined in. Women became engineers, men became technicians, and young people found new hope in their own potential. Solar power became more than just a source of light, it became a symbol of self-reliance, of dignity, of a new way of living. Bunker Roy didn't just give them light. He gave them the knowledge to see their own futures, a future where they were no longer forgotten, but where they were the ones who would shine. At Barefoot College, Bunker Roy made an unconventional choice, a choice that seemed, at first glance, almost impossible to believe. Instead of bringing in young men, trained engineers, or high-tech experts, he turned to a group of women who had long been dismissed by society. Grandmothers. Women in their 60s and 70s. Women whose hands had spent decades weaving cloth, carrying water, cooking meals, and raising children. Women who had lived lives of struggle, resilience, and wisdom. Women who had been invisible for most of their lives. Bunker's vision was clear. The wisdom of these women, their deep-rooted knowledge of the land, of life, and of survival, could be harnessed in ways no one had ever thought possible. They may not have had formal education. They may not have worn white coats or held degrees, but they had something far more powerful: experience. Bunker believed that these women, who had nurtured families, communities, and traditions, were the perfect candidates to become engineers, not of machines, but of change. He saw in them the strength and resilience that could transform villages. Their ability to adapt, to learn, to carry the weight of generations, these were the qualities that could shape the future. And so, he invited these grandmothers from the most remote villages in India to come to Barefoot College, where they would learn to become solar engineers. The world may have called them old, and the world may have underestimated them, but Bunker saw their true potential. And he wasn't just giving them a job, he was giving them a purpose, a dignity that had been denied to them their entire lives. The first time the grandmothers stood in front of a solar panel, their hands trembled, but they didn't back down. They learned how to assemble solar panels, how to install them, how to maintain them, and how to teach others. They may not have had the luxury of formal schooling, but they had something far deeper. They had the courage to embrace something new, something revolutionary. As they learned, they taught one another. The bond between these women became unbreakable. They didn't just create solar panels, they created a new narrative for themselves, one where they were no longer seen as mere caretakers, but as leaders, teachers, engineers. When the grandmothers completed their training, they went back to their villages, not just as solar engineers, but as symbols of empowerment. They were no longer invisible. They were no longer the forgotten ones. They were the heart of change, the hands of the future. Bunker Roy's choice to teach grandmothers wasn't just a lesson in engineering. It was a lesson in humanity. It was a lesson in the power of resilience and the unyielding strength of women who have lived through hardship. These women, who had once been told their place was in the home, became the true engineers of a better tomorrow. They built solar panels, yes, but more importantly, they built a future where age, gender, and background no longer determined a person's worth. The grandmothers of Barefoot College weren't just changing technology. They were changing the world's perception of who could be a leader and proving, once and for all, that the hands that had nurtured families could now nurture the future. The first woman to take on Bunker Roy's challenge wasn't a young student eager to learn or an experienced professional seeking new opportunities. No, the first woman was Mirabai, a grandmother who had never set foot in a school. Her world had been one of farming, family, and surviving the cycles of life that most never questioned. Her hands had never held a textbook, but they had held the weight of a lifetime. When Mirabai first heard about Barefoot College's solar engineering program, she was skeptical. She was a grandmother, after all, in her 60s, with a life full of hard work but very little formal education. What would she, a woman with no degrees, no technical training, no understanding of solar power, possibly have to offer? But something inside her stirred. Perhaps it was the desire to make a difference for her family. Perhaps it was the fire that had always burned within her, the fire that refused to be extinguished by age, by tradition, or by circumstance. Mirabai decided to take the leap. Under Bunker's guidance, Mirabai began to learn. The process was slow at first. The solar panels were foreign to her, the tools unfamiliar. But Bunker didn't treat her like a student struggling to catch up. He treated her like a force to be reckoned with. He gave her respect. He gave her knowledge. He gave her the tools to transform not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Days turned into weeks, and Mirabai's hands began to shape something more than just solar panels. She was shaping her own destiny. With each panel she assembled, each connection she made, her confidence grew. She wasn't just learning how to install a solar system. She was learning how to take control of her own future. And then, one day, it happened. Mirabai became the first woman from Barefoot College to install a solar panel in her own village. The people in her community had watched her journey with curiosity, some with doubt, but most with a quiet respect for the determination that had driven her. As the solar panel was installed, and the first light flickered on in her home, something incredible happened. It wasn't just a light that flickered to life, it was hope. The villagers had never seen anything like it. The light didn't just chase away the darkness, it illuminated something deeper. It was proof that change was possible. That even someone who had never been to school, someone who had lived a life defined by limitation, could become an agent of transformation. Mirabai didn't just bring light to her village, she brought the light of possibility. She became a living example that anyone, no matter their age, no matter their background, could change the world, one step at a time. And in that moment, as Mirabai stood in front of her home, the village lit by the solar panels she had installed with her own hands, the world around her shifted. She had ignited a spark that would catch fire. She had proven that the power to change, to rise above, didn't lie in certificates or degrees. It lay in the strength of a person's will, in their hands, in their heart. Mirabai's light, the light of the solar panels and the light of her courage, became a glimmer of hope for everyone who had ever been told they were too old, too poor, too invisible to make a difference. Her story spread far and wide, and as it did, more and more women, like her, saw the possibility of a brighter future. They saw that they, too, could become engineers. They, too, could light the way for others. When the grandmothers of Barefoot College returned to their villages after installing their first solar systems, the world around them began to change in ways no one could have predicted. They weren't returning as experts, as professionals trained in the ways of traditional education, or as people with titles on their resumes. They were returning as something more powerful, as pioneers of a new world. For years, the world had told them they were too old, too uneducated, too invisible to make a difference. But the reality was different. The truth, as Barefoot College had proven, was simple. People don't need experts. They need opportunity. And that was exactly what Bunker Roy had given them. An opportunity to learn, to create, to transform, not just their lives, but the lives of everyone around them. When these grandmothers went back home, they didn't return as passive recipients of aid. They returned as changemakers, armed with knowledge and the power to share it. One solar panel at a time, they brought light into homes that had lived in darkness for generations. But the light they brought wasn't just physical. It was a light of hope, of potential, of possibility. The first village to see a change was often the one where Mirabai had started her journey. The villagers, initially skeptical, watched in awe as the woman they had always seen as a caretaker became an engineer, a teacher, a leader. And as the solar panels flickered to life, so did the dreams of the villagers. These grandmothers were no longer just elderly women who had spent their lives in the kitchen or the fields. They were teachers of a new way of life. They were solar engineers, yes, but more importantly, they were beacons of empowerment. They showed their communities that age was no barrier to learning, that wisdom didn't come from degrees but from lived experience. The word spread quickly. One by one, more grandmothers from neighboring villages came forward, eager to take part in the revolution that was quietly sweeping through rural India. They, too, began to install solar panels, to light their homes and their futures. And with each new panel, a new door was opened, a door to economic independence, to education, to a brighter future. These women didn't just light up villages, they lit up hearts. They showed the world that the true power of change doesn't lie in experts or foreign aid. It lies in the hands of those who have been forgotten by society but are ready to stand up and reclaim their right to be seen, heard, and respected. The ripple effect of their work didn't stop at solar panels. It sparked a movement that spread across the country, a movement that said, "We are not too old, we are not too poor, we are not invisible." By the time the first few solar systems were installed, Barefoot College had proved something powerful, that true education doesn't have to come from a classroom or an institution. It comes from the heart, it comes from the land, it comes from within. And when people are given the opportunity to use their own hands, their own knowledge, and their own strength, they can change the world in ways no expert ever could. The grandmothers of Barefoot College weren't just lighting up homes, they were lighting up an entire generation's understanding of what it means to be truly educated. They weren't just installing solar panels, they were installing a new world of light, a world where opportunity, not expertise, was the key to empowerment and change. Bunker Roy's journey wasn't the smooth path of an idealistic dreamer. It was a rough and jagged road filled with challenges, doubt, and resistance. From the very beginning, critics came forward, questioning the feasibility of his vision. They didn't see the potential in the people of the villages. They didn't see the possibility in the grandmothers who had never held a textbook in their hands. The critics said it was impossible. They asked how a group of women, many in their 60s and 70s, could possibly handle the complexities of solar energy. They scoffed at the idea that villagers with no formal education could become solar engineers. Solar energy is too technical, too advanced, they said. These women don't have the training, the knowledge, the background. They are too old to learn something so complicated. But Bunker Roy didn't waver. He didn't listen to those who said it couldn't be done. His belief in the power of real people and the untapped potential of ordinary individuals was unwavering. He knew, deep down, that real change doesn't come from high-tech solutions or from experts with degrees. It comes from the people who are closest to the land, the ones who have lived through hardship and who understand the true value of community. Bunker's conviction was simple: real change requires real people. It requires the ones who have been overlooked, the ones who have been underestimated. It requires the grandmothers, the farmers, the everyday people who may not have formal training but have something far more powerful: resilience, wisdom, and an unshakable drive to improve their lives. For Bunker, the critics were simply obstacles to be overcome, not barriers that could stop his mission. He had witnessed the brilliance of these women firsthand. He had seen their hands, worn and weathered by years of hard labor, gently handle the delicate solar panels. He had watched them learn, grow, and succeed, defying every expectation along the way. While others questioned the idea, Bunker saw something different. He saw that the real challenge wasn't the technology. It wasn't the solar panels, the wiring, or the complex circuitry. The real challenge was convincing the world that these women, these grandmothers, had the capacity to lead a revolution. The real challenge was getting people to see the value in a kind of education that wasn't measured by certificates or formal degrees. But even in the face of doubt, Bunker's belief never faltered. He knew the answer wasn't to go out and find the perfect candidates for solar engineering. The answer was to empower the people who were already there, the ones who had lived through the toughest of times, who knew how to make do with what they had, and who were ready to rise above the limitations that had been placed upon them. For Bunker, this wasn't just about teaching solar energy. It was about teaching the world that true change doesn't come from outside experts. It comes from within. It comes from the people who live it, who breathe it, who are willing to fight for it even when others say it's impossible. And as the grandmothers began to return to their villages, installing solar panels and lighting up the darkened homes, the critics' voices grew quieter. The results spoke for themselves. These women weren't just installing solar panels. They were changing the way the world saw power, technology, and education. The critics had been wrong. They didn't understand what Bunker knew all along, that real change isn't about credentials. It's about belief. And belief, in the hands of the right people, can move mountains. The spark that started in Tylonia was no longer confined to the borders of Rajasthan. What began as a quiet, humble experiment teaching grandmothers in dusty desert villages to harness the power of the sun had grown into something far greater. The Barefoot College was no longer just a school. It had become a movement. As the years passed, word began to spread. People from other villages came to see the miracle with their own eyes. Homes lit by solar energy, installed not by outside engineers, but by the grandmothers who had once sat quietly in the corners of their communities. Journalists, development workers, and curious travelers from around the world began to visit Tylonia. What they found there challenged everything they thought they knew about education, empowerment, and change. The women once dismissed as unqualified were now being hailed as innovators. They were speaking at international forums, not with polished English or rehearsed speeches, but with truth. Raw, lived truth. They spoke of learning through hands-on experience, of dignity, of self-reliance, and of the quiet revolution that was turning villages of darkness into islands of light. Governments began to take notice. NGOs and global organizations reached out, eager to understand how such profound impact was being achieved without high-end technology or massive funding. What they discovered was a blueprint for grassroots transformation, one that didn't rely on charity, but on trust. By the mid-2000s, women from Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia were traveling to Tylonia. They didn't speak the same languages, but they shared the same struggles: poverty, powerlessness, and being pushed to the margins of society. At Barefoot College, those barriers didn't matter. With color-coded tools, body language, and shared determination, these women learned to become solar engineers. They returned to their countries, to Sierra Leone, to Bolivia, to Myanmar, carrying not just technical knowledge, but a newfound sense of worth. They brought solar power to their homes, schools, and clinics. But more importantly, they brought something invisible and priceless: the belief that they could lead. The Barefoot model shattered long-held assumptions about development. It proved that the answers didn't always lie in high-tech labs or elite universities. Sometimes, the solutions lay with those who had been denied a voice if only someone was willing to listen. As awards began to pour in, Bunker Roy accepted them not for himself, but on behalf of the women who had turned his vision into reality. The grandmothers, the farmers, the barefoot engineers, the ones who had turned wrenches and dreams into light. The college became more than an institution. It became a symbol, a beacon that said, you don't need to be rich, young, or educated to change the world. You just need a chance, and that message resonated across continents. From Himalayan villages to African plains, from Amazonian tribes to war-torn regions, Barefoot College was inspiring a new generation of community-driven leaders. The revolution had gone global. In a world too often divided by class, race, and opportunity, Barefoot College became proof that true wisdom doesn't need credentials. It just needs someone to believe in it. With every new solar project, Bunker's once audacious vision leapt off the drawing board and into real life. It was no longer just an idea. It was a movement, a quiet, steady revolution reshaping the future of villages across the globe. Women who had once spent their days sweeping courtyards, fetching water, or tending to cattle now stood tall on rooftops, balancing solar panels on their shoulders, wiring batteries, and lighting up homes. The same hands that had stirred cooking pots were now soldering circuits. These women, grandmothers, mothers, daughters, were no longer invisible. They had become engineers, leaders, providers of light. In village after village, word spread, the light came from one of our own. No outside technician, no fancy degree, just a neighbor, a woman they'd known all their lives, now bringing light not only to homes but to minds clouded by doubt. From India's desert regions to the savannas of Kenya, from Nepal's hills to Sierra Leone's riverbanks, small villages once cut off from the world were being transformed by solar power and even more, by human power. Each village had a story. A grandmother who'd never touched a book now lighting up 50 homes. A mother of 5 training the next batch of barefoot engineers. A widow, once dependent, now running a solar-powered workshop of her own. Children could now study after sunset. Health centers could run refrigeration for medicine. Community centers could hold meetings after dark. And it was all made possible by women who had once been written off by society. With wires in their hands and determination in their hearts, they changed everything. But the transformation wasn't just about energy. It was about dignity. For generations, these women had been told to stay quiet, stay inside, and stay small. But now, the village came to them with questions, with respect, with admiration. Their voices, once silenced, now carried power. And they didn't stop with just lighting homes. Once empowered, they took on other challenges: water filtration, sanitation, women's health, education. With each problem solved, confidence grew. And with confidence came a sense of ownership, a realization that they didn't need to wait for help. They could be the help. In these villages full of solar engineers, a new model of leadership emerged, one that didn't shout, but shined. One that didn't seek headlines, but created legacy. Bunker's dream had always been about more than just solar panels. It was about unlocking human potential. And now, that potential was illuminating the world, one empowered woman at a time. This wasn't charity. It wasn't aid. It was self-reliance. Community-driven, grassroots-powered, and it was working. In every glowing home, in every child reading late into the night, in every grandmother explaining circuits to a younger apprentice, Bunker's dream pulsed like a heartbeat. A village full of solar engineers wasn't just a possibility, it had become a reality. Barefoot College had started with a simple goal: to empower the forgotten people of rural India. But what Bunker Roy built in Tylonia didn't stay in Tylonia. It grew, evolved, and spread, not like a wildfire, but like sunlight breaking through the clouds, quietly, steadily, and with purpose. Soon, the dusty desert campus became more than just a school. It became a global sanctuary, a training ground where women from across continents came not just to learn about solar energy, but to rediscover their strength. They arrived barefoot. Some had never traveled beyond their own village. Some had never been in an airplane or seen a light bulb. Women from Uganda, Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, Bhutan, Guatemala, and Nepal, most of them grandmothers, made their way to Tylonia. None spoke English. Most were illiterate. But none of that mattered at Barefoot College. They communicated with color-coded tools, gestures, drawings, and smiles. They were taught not with textbooks, but with patience. They didn't just learn how to install solar panels, they learned to believe in themselves. To return home as pioneers, carrying light, both literally and figuratively. The 6-month training program became a bridge from isolation to inclusion, from dependency to leadership. These women learned to assemble charge controllers, wire circuits, install battery units, and maintain entire solar systems. But they also learned something far more powerful, that they were capable of changing the world. And when they returned to their villages, often welcomed with wide eyes and tears, they brought more than just solar kits. They brought hope. They brought stories. They brought transformation. Imagine a woman from a small village in rural Africa, standing atop a tin roof with a tool belt around her waist, showing a younger generation how to harness sunlight. Or a grandmother from the Himalayas, lighting up her village's first school with her own 2 hands. These were once unthinkable images, but at Barefoot College, they became real. Every graduating class became a wave of quiet revolutionaries, barefoot engineers carrying the knowledge of light into the darkest corners of the world. Bunker Roy didn't just build a school, he built a philosophy. One that said, you don't need to read or write to be brilliant, you don't need to be young to learn, and you don't need permission to lead. And the world began to listen. From the United Nations to TED stages, from rural development conferences to documentaries aired around the globe, Barefoot College stood as a bold and beautiful contradiction to conventional wisdom. While others looked to technology for solutions, Bunker looked to people, to the grandmothers no one noticed, to the wisdom hidden in silence, to the light within the overlooked. The Barefoot College became a global university without walls, one where age, language, and literacy were not barriers, but bridges. And through that vision, villages once shrouded in darkness were slowly, beautifully lighting up. At Barefoot College, solar engineering was only the surface. What Bunker Roy truly offered was something far more profound: resilience. Not the kind you read in books, but the kind that's felt deep in the bones. The kind built slowly, through failure, sweat, and stubborn hope. From the very beginning, Bunker understood that the real light he was trying to spread wasn't just solar power. It was human power. It was the power of a village that believed in itself. A community that didn't wait for handouts. One that stood up and said, "We've got this." Inside the campus, people from every background sat side by side. Grandmothers from Africa, farmers from India, single mothers, dropouts, dreamers. They came with empty hands, but they left with full hearts and fierce minds. Resilience was woven into every lesson. When a circuit failed, they didn't throw it away, they fixed it. When a language barrier came up, they didn't give up, they pointed, laughed, mimed, and kept going. When someone said, "You can't do this," they said, "Watch me." The Rail curriculum was not about wires and panels, it was about confidence, grit, dignity, and the transformation wasn't temporary. It didn't vanish when the workshops ended. These women carried their new strength back into their homes, their families, their villages. They passed it on like fire from one torch to another. Soon, communities that had once relied on outsiders were building their own futures. They fixed their own lights, managed their own resources, and made their own decisions. They started schools, trained others, and built local councils to govern themselves. They didn't just become solar engineers, they became problem solvers. In many places, disaster struck: floods, droughts, poverty. But these communities stood firm. Why? Because resilience had been planted deep. Because they weren't dependent on experts in distant cities. They had become the experts. Bunker had always believed that true development didn't come from the top down, it came from the inside out. And Barefoot College became a living example of that. Electricity could light a room, but resilience, real, grounded, community-grown resilience, could light a future. At Barefoot College, every wire laid and every light bulb installed whispered the same message: you are enough. You always were. And that, more than any solar panel, is what lit up the world. Bunker Roy didn't just reimagine education. He redefined what it meant to lead. And in doing so, he struck at one of society's oldest boundaries, the role of women. In many of the regions where Barefoot College reached, women were expected to stay in the background. Their lives were often confined to the home, cooking, cleaning, caring. They were told they were too old, too uneducated, too poor to matter. Their place in society was fixed, or so everyone thought. But Bunker believed something different. He believed that these women held within them a deep, untapped well of strength, not despite their age or background, but because of it. And so he didn't just invite them to learn, he dared them to lead. At Barefoot College, women who had never been to school became teachers. Those who had never spoken in public stood before international audiences. And grandmothers who had never touched a tool were now fixing electrical systems, training engineers, and guiding teams. In communities where women were once expected to remain silent, They were now making decisions for their homes, their villages, and their futures. They became role models, earning not only respect, but reverence. The impact rippled outward. Young girls saw their grandmothers climbing ladders and connecting wires, and suddenly, their own dreams expanded. Mothers saw their neighbors leading solar workshops and realized their own potential had not faded with time. And many fathers, sons, husbands began to see women not just as helpers, but as equals, as leaders, as changemakers. The transformation wasn't easy. There were skeptics. There was resistance. In some places, women were discouraged or even threatened for stepping out of their traditional roles. But they stood firm, not with loud protests, but with quiet, undeniable proof. Lit homes, working schools, growing communities. They broke barriers, not with force, but with light. One by one, the walls built by centuries of exclusion began to crack, not because someone tore them down, but because these women rose above them. They didn't wait for permission. They took the tools, the knowledge, and the courage they found at Barefoot College and built a new path where none had existed. This wasn't just about energy or education anymore. It was about revolution, a gentle, unstoppable one, led by those no one had expected to lead. Through Barefoot College, Bunker Roy had challenged the very structure of society. And the women who once stood at the margins were now standing at the center, not just participants, but pioneers. The world had told them they couldn't. They proved they could. And then they went further. In a world that often equates intelligence with degrees, diplomas, and certificates, Bunker Roy dared to ask a simple question. What if brilliance wasn't something you read in a book, but something you lived, every day? At Barefoot College, there was one golden rule. Literacy was not a requirement. You didn't need to read or write to become an engineer. You didn't need test scores or report cards to be considered smart. All you needed was willingness, and the courage to try. This opened the doors to a different kind of student, grandmothers who had never set foot in a classroom. Women who had been told their whole lives that education wasn't for them. But at Barefoot College, they were welcomed like scholars. They learned using colors instead of numbers, diagrams instead of paragraphs, songs instead of lectures. Blue wire meant positive, red meant negative. A picture of the sun meant charge. A drawing of a battery meant storage. Every lesson was built around one simple truth. People learn best when you teach in their language, the language of experience, of the senses, of the real world. There were no whiteboards, no exams, no long essays. Instead, there were hands-on tools, trial and error, and community. Students learned by doing, by taking apart circuits, soldering wires, and assembling panels. And if they got it wrong, they tried again, together. It wasn't just about solar energy. It was about building confidence. Every click of a wire, every glowing light bulb was a small triumph, a reminder that they were more capable than they'd ever been told. Outside the campus, the world still clung to outdated ideas, that only the educated could solve problems. But inside the mud walls of Barefoot College, those ideas were being quietly dismantled, day by day, connection by connection, light by light. These women didn't just learn how to bring electricity to their villages. They learned that intelligence wears many faces, that survival, raising children through drought, farming through famine, navigating life without access, is its own kind of genius. And slowly, the message began to spread. Education isn't about memorizing facts. It's about making meaning. It's about solving real problems. It's about believing you can even if the world says you can't. At Barefoot College, intelligence had nothing to do with literacy and everything to do with resilience, heart, and hope. And the women who were once overlooked became the brightest minds of all. It was a sight that challenged every stereotype the world had ever known. Grandmothers in vibrant saris, their hair streaked with silver, sitting cross-legged on dusty floors, not weaving, not cooking, not waiting, but building. They weren't surrounded by textbooks or chalkboards, but by pliers, circuit boards, and wires. Their bangles clinked gently as they stripped insulation from copper lines. Their fingers, once used for kneading dough or stitching cloth, now held soldering irons, connecting solar circuits with the precision of master engineers. This was the new normal at Barefoot College. A sari and a screwdriver, tradition and technology, age and innovation, all working in harmony, without conflict, without apology. These women weren't trying to imitate anyone. They weren't changing who they were to fit into someone else's idea of modern. They were showing that modernity could meet tradition on equal ground. That wisdom wrapped in a sari could power a revolution. In every room, there was laughter and learning. Charts hung on the walls, not in English or Hindi, but in shapes, colors, and symbols. A red sun for power, a blue square for a circuit, a green dot for a completed connection. And these women, some who had never touched a light switch before, were now designing, assembling, and repairing full solar units from scratch. They built charge controllers, LED lanterns, and battery boxes. Then they packed them in bags and carried them home, not as students, but as solar engineers. They didn't just fix lights, they fixed belief. The belief that they were too old to learn. The belief that technical work is for men. The belief that progress and tradition cannot exist together. Barefoot College proved that none of that was true. Because here, a woman in a sari could build a future with her own hands. She could wear her culture with pride and still carry the power of science in her palms. And as villages lit up with solar-powered homes, people no longer looked at these women as just grandmothers. They saw them for what they truly were: pioneers, builders, role models. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary thing in the world is watching someone who was never expected to lead quietly change everything. Solar circuits and saris, old hands, new light. In villages that once slept in darkness, the world began to change. The flicker of candlelight and the glow of kerosene lamps, so familiar, yet so limiting, were replaced with something new, something brighter, something with the power to redefine a life. Children, once forced to stop studying as the sun set, now studied late into the night under the steady, clean light of solar lamps. Their schoolbooks no longer had to close with the sun. They could read, write, and dream long after the stars came out. Shops that once shut down at dusk now stayed open after sunset. With their doors lit up by solar-powered lights, they stayed vibrant, full of activity, and busy well into the evening. The owners, often women, no longer needed to close up early to conserve fuel or rely on unreliable power sources. They could work freely, without fear of being cut off from the world. But it wasn't just business hours that changed, it was lives. For the first time in years, villagers didn't fear the night. They didn't fear the darkness that once signaled an end to their daily hopes and dreams. Now, the night was simply another part of life, just like the day. The streets were safer, the air was quieter, the children studied longer, and the elders stayed up to tell stories without worrying about the fuel running out. Fear, the kind that creeps in when you're left in the dark, literally and figuratively, began to fade. And in its place, something beautiful bloomed: freedom. Freedom to read after dark. Freedom to finish the day's work, uninterrupted. Freedom to gather without the dark shadows of isolation creeping in. Freedom to stay connected with the world. It was a freedom that extended beyond just the ability to see at night. It was the freedom to build, to learn, to grow, and to live without limitations. Because light, the kind that doesn't flicker out in the middle of a storm, the kind that doesn't burn you with toxic fumes, brought more than just visibility. It brought life. It brought hope. It brought the power to create new possibilities, even after the sun had set. In those villages, the night didn't just turn to day, it turned to possibility. It turned to change. It turned to a future built on the power of light and the resilience of the people who had reclaimed it. And with that light, everything else followed: progress, growth, and the belief that the future was no longer something to wait for, but something to create. Bunker Roy didn't look like the typical person invited to speak before world leaders. He didn't wear a suit, didn't carry a polished briefcase, and didn't stand on ceremony. Instead, he stood before them with the simplicity of Tylonia, a village where dignity, not status, defined the worth of a person. It was a stage unlike any other. Powerful men and women in suits sat in the audience, expecting a polished speech, numbers, facts, strategies. But what they got was something far more profound. Bunker Roy, a man who had spent decades working with people deemed unimportant, uneducated, and forgotten, stood before them and spoke a truth that cut through all the superficialities of global politics. He spoke not just for himself, but for the grandmothers in saris fixing solar panels, for the women in villages lighting up the night, for the men and children who had lived in the shadows of society's blind spots. His voice was calm but firm. He didn't raise his voice to demand attention. It wasn't necessary. His words commanded the room, not with volume, but with truth. He told them, Don't look down on the poor. They have skills, wisdom, and dignity. Give them a chance, and they will transform the world. In that moment, Bunker wasn't just advocating for solar energy. He wasn't just asking for more recognition for Barefoot College. He was giving voice to the voiceless, to every person who had been dismissed, marginalized, or ignored. The world had always been taught to see the poor as helpless, as people who needed charity, or worse, pity. But Bunker saw them as experts, as people with untapped potential, as leaders waiting for a chance to prove themselves. And it wasn't just about changing the lives of those living in poverty. It was about changing the entire way the world saw development, progress, and success. Bunker challenged the very notion that the solutions to the world's biggest problems always had to come from the rich and powerful. He showed the world that the answers could come from anywhere, from anyone. Give them a chance, he said, and they will transform the world. And that's exactly what they did. Barefoot engineers, barefoot leaders, barefoot changemakers. People who were once seen as invisible were now changing everything. The message wasn't just a call to action, it was a declaration of human potential. It was a call to stop underestimating the power that lies in the hands of those society often overlooks. Because once the world gives them the chance, these people can rebuild it one village, one panel, one bright light at a time. In the heart of Tylonia, there was a college unlike any other. It didn't hand out diplomas or certificates. There were no uniforms, no caps and gowns, no classrooms filled with rows of desks, no lectures filled with jargon or formulas. It wasn't the kind of college that society typically recognized. There were no prestigious titles hanging on walls, no academic degrees framed and displayed. No one walked out of Barefoot College with a formal education stamped on their resume. What they walked out with was far more valuable: knowledge, confidence, and the power to change their communities. Because at Barefoot College, the proof wasn't in the paper. It wasn't in the grades, or in the test scores. The proof was in the results. The proof was in the glowing homes that once sat in darkness. It was in the villages where mothers could safely study at night, where children learned long after sunset, where businesses stayed open, thriving in the after hours. The proof was in the eyes of the grandmothers, who, with every solar panel they installed, gained more than just a skill. They gained a sense of purpose, a spark of hope, and a newfound belief in their own worth. It was in the courage of every barefoot student, the women and men, young and old, who had been told for years that they didn't belong in a classroom, that they weren't smart enough or skilled enough to contribute. But here, they were shown that intelligence isn't measured by tests or certificates. It's measured by how much change you can create in the world. The lessons were simple. They were about life, about resilience, about community, about problem solving, about hands-on learning. And every student, no matter their age or background, became a living testament to the fact that the greatest achievements aren't always the ones written down on paper. So, there were no diplomas at Barefoot College, no fancy titles, but there didn't need to be, because the transformation was real. It was visible. It was felt by every villager who now had light, by every grandmother who became a leader, by every barefoot student who now knew that they could and would change the world. And that, in the end, was the only degree that mattered. As Barefoot College grew, so did its impact, and it wasn't just about the solar panels, or the lights, or the technology. It was about something much deeper, something more profound. When a solar engineer returned to her village, she wasn't just bringing a skill. She wasn't simply installing panels or wiring up systems. She was carrying something far more powerful: the knowledge that she could make a difference, the belief that she could transform her community. Each installation became more than just a technical job. It became the spark for a chain of change. One solar panel on a roof didn't just light up a home, it lit up the possibilities for an entire village. It gave families the freedom to stay up late, the freedom to run businesses after dark, the freedom to learn, to grow, to move forward. Women, who had spent their lives caring for homes and families, now began to run their own businesses. With the power of solar lighting up their homes and shops, they could operate after the sun had set, doubling their work hours and boosting their income. They didn't just become business owners, they became leaders, pioneers, and role models for others. Families gained independence. No longer reliant on expensive, unreliable, and hazardous energy sources like kerosene, they could power their homes sustainably, affordably, and safely. The extra income, the extra hours of productivity, and the newfound sense of autonomy created ripple effects that spread across entire communities. As more women installed solar systems, more villages began to thrive. Each woman, each solar engineer, was a change agent in her own right. She didn't just learn to build a solar panel, she learned to rebuild her life, her family, her community. And in doing so, she ignited a chain of events that spread far beyond her village. Children could study at night. Farmers could irrigate fields without expensive diesel generators. Shops stayed open longer. Electricity wasn't just about light, it was about empowerment. It was about agency. It was about breaking free from the shackles of poverty, one solar panel at a time. Communities, once fragmented by hardship and isolation, became stronger. They became self-reliant, united, and driven by a collective sense of possibility. The ripple effect wasn't just about technology. It was about transforming the mindset of entire communities. It was about showing them that they didn't need outsiders to save them, they just needed a chance to use the skills and wisdom they already had. And so, as the college grew, so did the ripple, expanding, reaching further, and touching more lives. The impact wasn't just in the number of panels installed, but in the number of lives transformed. One solar panel at a time. One woman, one village, one community at a time. And with every ripple, a wave of change surged forward, unstoppable, undeniable, and inspiring others to follow in its wake. One woman, one panel, one dream. Bunker Roy had always believed in the power of the individual. In a world where it's easy to think that change can only come from governments, corporations, or big organizations, Bunker saw something different. He saw the untapped potential of a single person, and in particular, the incredible force of a single woman who had the right tools, knowledge, and belief. For Bunker, the foundation of transformation wasn't in large-scale initiatives or massive resources. It was in the quiet power of one. One woman could light up an entire village. One solar panel could spark a movement. One dream could fuel a revolution. At Barefoot College, he witnessed this truth unfold over and over again. These women, many of them grandmothers, mothers, or wives, were not waiting for someone to rescue them. They were rescuing themselves. And in doing so, they were showing the world that change doesn't need to come from the top down. It doesn't need to be grand, flashy, or monumental. Change can start with one woman, armed with nothing more than the courage to act. These women were the embodiment of self-reliance. They weren't sitting around, waiting for someone to give them a job or provide them with resources. They were creating their own opportunities. They were using their hands, their hearts, and their intellect to build something real, to build a future for themselves and their communities. Bunker's faith in these women was unwavering. He saw something in them that others often overlooked: an unmatched resilience, an unshakable strength, and an inherent capacity to build, nurture, and transform. With every panel they installed, every home they powered, every business they started, they proved that the power of one could indeed change the world. They didn't wait for help. They created it. They became the architects of their own destinies, showing the world that change doesn't come from waiting for someone to hand it to you. It comes from acting on your own potential, believing in yourself, and taking the first step, no matter how small. And as these women changed their villages began to change the world. One woman, one panel, one dream at a time. And in their collective power, they built a future brighter than anyone had ever imagined. The Barefoot College didn't just stop at India. Its vision was too big to be contained within one country, one village, or even one continent. The message of empowerment, sustainability, and self-reliance traveled far beyond Tylonia's dusty roads, reaching corners of the world that had never known the power of the sun. From Africa to Latin America to Southeast Asia, the model that Bunker Roy had created found fertile ground. Women, once limited by geography and circumstance, were now being trained to light up their villages, to bring power to places that had been forgotten by the world. In the villages of Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Zambia, women learned to install solar panels just like the grandmothers of Tylonia had. These women, who had never seen electricity, who had never known what it was like to flip a switch and have light flood the room, were now the ones installing solar systems that would transform entire communities. In Latin America, communities in rural Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala began to harness the power of the sun. Women became the solar engineers, and as they gained the knowledge, they shared it with others, ensuring that the ripple of change stretched far beyond the borders of their own villages. The glow of solar panels wasn't just lighting homes, it was lighting a path toward independence, opportunity, and equality. Across Southeast Asia, women from countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, and the Philippines joined the movement. They carried the same light that had powered the remote villages of India, bringing with them the hope of a brighter future. In these countries, where access to electricity had been scarce or unreliable, solar power became more than just a resource, it became a lifeline. From Tylonia, solar power became a global movement. It was no longer just about providing light. It was about providing the opportunity for people to rise, to create their own futures, and to solve their own problems. It was about showing that, no matter where you came from or how little you had, you could change your world with the tools and knowledge at your fingertips. As the movement spread, it wasn't just about technology. It was about empowerment. It was about women who had once been marginalized, overlooked, and underestimated rising as leaders, experts, and changemakers. And the world took notice. What started as a small idea in Tylonia, with just a handful of solar engineers, grew into a global force that demonstrated what was possible when people were given the chance to take charge of their own futures. Solar power became more than just energy. It became a symbol of what could be achieved when the right people were given the right tools. And from every corner of the globe, from every village and every woman who joined the movement, the message was clear. No one is too small to make a difference. No community is too far to be reached. And no dream is too big to be achieved. Bunker Roy's dream was never limited to just solar power. While the solar panels were the foundation, his vision reached far beyond energy. He wanted to show the world that the true power wasn't just in electricity, it was in the people, their creativity, and their potential. At Barefoot College, the goal was not just to teach solar engineering, it was to teach people how to dream, to empower individuals to think beyond what they had been told was possible, to break the boundaries of what was considered achievable for the poor, the uneducated, and the marginalized. In Tylonia, in the heart of rural India, Bunker believed that no dream was too big, no idea too radical, and this belief spread like wildfire across the college. As women and men came to learn solar power, they began to see that the world was full of opportunities that didn't require formal education or a degree from a prestigious institution. What was needed was the courage to imagine. At Barefoot College, there were no limits to what people could achieve. The education was not confined to solar panels, and the learning never stopped. Bunker recognized that there was no one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges of rural life. While solar power was an essential starting point, it was only one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Water management became another vital area. In villages where droughts were common, where water was scarce, Bunker understood that sustainable water solutions were as important as sustainable energy. So, Barefoot College started teaching water harvesting techniques, building rainwater collection systems, and teaching communities how to purify water using simple, cost-effective methods. These skills, once learned, transformed entire villages, helping people not only survive but thrive. The college also embraced healthcare, another vital aspect of rural living. In many of the remote villages, healthcare was limited or entirely out of reach. Barefoot College took the bold step of training local women to be health workers. These women became the lifelines for their communities, providing basic healthcare, maternal care, and educating others about hygiene and disease prevention. They didn't just become healers, they became leaders in a movement for better health and well-being. Bunker believed that education wasn't about passing exams or collecting certificates. It was about creating a culture of self-reliance, where people could look around them, see the challenges they faced, and come up with their own solutions. It wasn't about handing out answers from a textbook. It was about teaching people how to find the answers themselves. From agriculture to sanitation, from renewable energy to education, Barefoot College became a hub for learning and innovation that went far beyond solar energy. It became a space where anyone could come, regardless of their background, and learn how to improve their own life and the lives of others. Because for Bunker, the ultimate lesson was this: when you teach people to dream, when you show them that they have the power to shape their own future, they will build more than just solar panels or wells. They will build communities, relationships, and a new world based on the belief that no problem is too big and no dream is too small. Bunker Roy didn't build an empire. He didn't build monuments or skyscrapers. He didn't amass wealth or fame. What he built was something far more profound, far more enduring, a legacy. This legacy isn't something you'll find etched in gold or carved into stone. It lives on in the hearts and minds of the communities that Barefoot College touched. It lives in every woman who once thought her voice didn't matter, who now stands as a solar engineer, a teacher, a leader. It lives in every solar panel installed by a grandmother, who never had the chance to go to school but became the most important educator in her village. Bunker's vision was never about creating something that could be bought or sold. He didn't want to leave behind an empire. Instead, he wanted to ignite a movement, and that's exactly what he did. Barefoot College isn't just a place, it's a living, breathing example of what's possible when people are given the tools and the opportunity to believe in themselves. This isn't just a story of solar panels and technology. It's a story of resilience, of women who were told they were too old, too poor, too uneducated to make a difference, but who proved the world wrong. It's a story of communities that refused to remain in the shadows, communities that fought for their right to learn, to grow, and to thrive. The Barefoot College movement continues to inspire. It's a reminder that the greatest changes often come from the most unexpected places, from the most overlooked individuals. Those who have been dismissed as powerless are the very ones who are capable of changing the world. Every solar panel that lights up a home, every child who gets to study under electric lights, every village that now has access to clean water, every healthcare worker trained to help others, this is Bunker's legacy. It's not in a building or a statue. It's in the empowerment of the individuals, in the impact on the community, and in the ripple effect that spreads across the world. They came to Tylonia as strangers, grandmothers from distant corners of the world, from tiny villages in Africa, to mountainous regions in Nepal, to rural towns in Latin America. Many of them had never left their homes, never flown on an airplane, never heard English. But they all shared something powerful, a quiet fire inside them, a will to learn, a desire to bring light home. At Barefoot College, they sat side by side learning without a shared language, yet understanding everything. They laughed together, ate together, struggled together. Slowly, these grandmothers transformed into engineers, capable, confident, brilliant. And when they returned to their own villages, they didn't return the same. They brought more than solar panels. They brought knowledge. They brought pride. They brought a new sense of identity, not as passive caretakers, but as powerful changemakers. These women, once overlooked, became role models. In many places, for the first time in their lives, people listened to them. They were no longer invisible. They were leaders. In Uganda, a grandmother named Asha wired her entire village and taught others to do the same. In Bolivia, Rosa turned her small home into a training center for solar education. In Bhutan, Sonam lit up remote homes that had never seen a light bulb. And though separated by continents, they stayed connected, not just through WhatsApp or photos, but through a shared purpose. They were now part of something larger, a global family, a network of women who had turned on the lights, not only in their homes, but in their communities' hearts and minds. What began in one dusty village in Rajasthan became a worldwide revolution, a living testimony that real change starts with trust, with dignity, and with the radical idea that even the most marginalized have the power to lead. This was not charity, it was solidarity. And in this family, every grandmother was a sister, every student was a teacher, every light switched on was a spark for generations to come. Barefoot College didn't just train solar engineers, it connected souls, it united villages, it built a family without borders, without degrees, but with endless light. Bunker Roy didn't just challenge the education system, he flipped it on its head. In a world obsessed with grades, exams, and degrees, he asked a simple but powerful question: what good is education if it doesn't serve your community? While others chased accolades and academic honors, Bunker walked away from it all, from privilege, from power, to find answers in the dust of forgotten villages. At Barefoot College, there were no tests to pass, no certificates to frame, no ranks, uniforms, or titles, because real learning, he believed, wasn't about competition. It was about connection. It wasn't about memorizing facts. It was about solving problems with your hands, your heart, and your hope. He dared to say that a grandmother who had never stepped inside a classroom could learn to build a solar panel, that a farmer could become a water engineer, that a shepherd could become a teacher, and that none of them needed a piece of paper to prove their worth. The world called it rebellion. He called it common sense. Bunker redefined the classroom: no walls, no desks, just the real world. His textbooks were tools. His chalkboard was the sky. His curriculum? Whatever the village needed most. Whether it was clean water, electricity, health, or self-respect, that became the lesson. He didn't teach people how to escape their communities. He taught them how to transform them. In doing so, he reminded the world of a truth we had forgotten: education is not what you carry in your bag, it's what you carry in your soul. It's not what helps you get ahead, it's what helps you lift others up. Bunker Roy was not just an educator, he was a revolutionary. A quiet rebel who rewrote the rules of what it means to be wise, to be skilled, and above all, to be human. And thanks to him, thousands of barefoot teachers, engineers, and visionaries now walk the earth, lighting the way for a future where no one is left behind. He could have had it all: the titles, the offices, the acclaim. Bunker Roy was born into a life paved with privilege, educated among elites, groomed for a future of comfort and applause. But comfort never called to him. What did was something far more powerful: the silent suffering of the forgotten. While others followed maps drawn for them, Bunker chose the unbeaten path. He walked into villages scorched by the sun, cracked by drought, ignored by progress. And instead of offering charity, he offered dignity. Instead of speaking, he listened. The fire inside him was not one that flickered with fame, it burned with purpose. He didn't build Barefoot College for praise or profit. He built it because something inside him refused to stay silent when the world turned away from the poor. It wasn't a job. It wasn't even just a school. It was a mission of the soul. Decade after decade, he showed up not with suits and speeches, but with open hands and relentless conviction. He worked beside grandmothers, slept in mud huts, shared food with villagers, and smiled with the kind of peace only purpose can bring. The dust of Tylonia clung to him, not as dirt, but as devotion. Others retired. He re-inspired. Others gave up. He dug deeper. When doubts came, when funds were low, when critics barked, the fire kept burning. Because Bunker had seen what the world had missed: the untapped brilliance of the rural poor, the raw genius in weathered hands, the quiet leadership in humble hearts. He believed until others began to believe too. He dreamed until his dreams lit up thousands of homes. And through every sleepless night, every challenge, every impossible, his passion never dimmed. Because Barefoot College wasn't a chapter in his life, it was his life. It wasn't built with bricks alone, but with belief. And long after the sun set each day, the fire inside Bunker Roy kept glowing, not to warm himself, but to light the way for others. The mark of a true leader isn't how brightly they shine, it's how many others they ignite. As the years passed, Bunker Roy began to step back. Not because the fire within him faded, but because it had already spread. Across dusty roads and desert winds, in the laughter of children reading under solar lamps, in the confident hands of grandmothers soldering circuits, his spirit lived on. The students he once taught with symbols and stories, now taught others. The women he empowered to rise, now helped entire villages to stand. Those who once came to Barefoot College for hope, became beacons of hope themselves. He had planted seeds in the minds of the overlooked, the ignored, the underestimated. And now, a forest of changemakers stood tall in every corner of the world. From the savannas of Africa to the mountain villages of Nepal, from South American highlands to Indian deserts, they carried the torch with quiet pride. They weren't waiting for saviors. They were the saviors of their own communities. And Bunker? He watched not as a hero in the spotlight, but as a gardener watching a garden bloom. "I was never the answer," he once said. "They were always the answer. I just helped them hear their own voice." The Barefoot College was never meant to depend on one man. It was meant to outlive him. And it has. Because the greatest legacy isn't made of stone or steel, it's made of people. People who rise, who teach, who believe. And now, those people, the torchbearers, are walking barefoot, head held high, into a future full of light. He never craved fame. He didn't seek fortune. He walked slowly, deliberately, with his feet on the ground and his heart among the people. Bunker Roy didn't wear a cape. He didn't sit in boardrooms or carry briefcases filled with numbers and plans. He wore the dust of villages like a badge of honor. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, the world leaned in, because he spoke the language of truth. He gave the world something far more powerful than technology or aid. He gave it belief. The belief that even the forgotten can lead, that even the unlettered can teach. That real intelligence has nothing to do with test scores and everything to do with compassion, creativity, and courage. He taught us that education isn't something handed down from the top. It's something that rises from the soil, from lived experience, from calloused hands, from the wisdom of women who had never stepped into a classroom, but had mastered the lessons of life. Walk barefoot, he said, because when your feet touch the earth, you remember where you come from, you remember who you are, and you never forget the people. He turned grandmothers into engineers. He turned skeptics into believers. He turned dusty towns into hubs of light and possibility. And he did it all, not with power, but with purpose. Today, solar panels shine on rooftops thousands of miles from Tylonia. Villages glow with hope. Women stand tall with tools in their hands and pride in their hearts, not because Bunker Roy told them what to do, but because he showed them they already had the strength. He wasn't just a man, he was a movement. And though time may pass, his footprints, barefoot, bold, and brave, will never fade. Because when one person believes in the impossible, the world begins to change. And Bunker Roy believed. So now, so do we. In a world that often waits for heroes in suits and ties, a man in dusty clothes walked into silence and created light. He listened to those no one listened to. He trained the ones the world had forgotten. He didn't build a college. He built a revolution, with no degrees, no desks, only dignity. This is the legacy of Bunker Roy, a man who taught us that sometimes, the ones who know the least on paper, can teach the most to the world. If this story lit a spark in you, don't let it fade. Share this story, and help others see the power of the unseen. Like the video to honor the barefoot engineers who light up the world. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories that awaken the heart. And always remember, you don't need a title to be a teacher. You don't need wealth to be a warrior. You just need one thing, the will to serve.